This remarkable hexagonal castle in a remote valley in Wiltshire was built in the late 1390s for John, the 5th Lord Lovell, one of the richest barons in England, and a kinsman of Richard II. Lovell's castle, now in partial ruin, was then as sophisticated as any building in Europe. Wardour was a symbol of Lovell's status, his closeness to Richard's opulent court and his cultural sophistication. However, by 1578, the new owner of the castle saw the need to convert it into an up-to-date Elizabethan residence, but less than 70 years later it was partially blown up in the Civil War. It will probably never be established whether the Wardour where King Alfred washed his hands and delivered judgment in a territorial dispute in about the year 900 was indeed Wardour in Wiltshire. But for practical purposes, the history of Wardour begins, and even that faintly enough, with the Great Survey of 1086. In this, the small manor of Wardour is recorded as being held under the king by the nuns of Wilton Abbey in Salisbury. For most of the 12th and 13th centuries, it was tenanted or owned by the St Martin family, until they sold it in 1386 to John, 5th Lord Lovell, for the cost of £1,000. Both Lord Lovell's career and the existence of Wardour Castle can largely be explained by John's marriage to Maud de Holland in about the year 1372. The Lovells were a substantial baronial family based at Minster Lovell in Oxfordshire, and although they were not one of the great families of England at that time, John and Maud's marriage gave them the possibility of becoming so. It was not only that Maud was an heiress, she also had good connections, with her father's cousins, the Hollands, being half-siblings to the future king Richard II. Richard was crowned king on the 6th of July 1377, aged just 10 years old, and as a boy he resented being overshadowed by his Plantagenet uncles, and sought to proclaim his divine right and gain control of his kingdom. Support for Richard came from his half-brothers, John and Thomas de Holland. The Hollands were rewarded with high offices and large grants of land. John de Holland was created Earl of Huntingdon and Duke of Exeter, whilst Thomas de Holland became the Earl of Kent, and on Thomas's death the title of Duke of Surrey was bestowed on his son. Through his 22-year reign, King Richard II was to run into financial difficulties, make political mistakes, fall suddenly from power, and die in captivity. But for at least a decade of his reign, King Richard II ruled as he saw fit. He was not a warrior like the kings before him, but a lover of luxury and a patron of architecture, painting, and all of the arts. And it was during this period that Wardour Castle was built by John and Maud Lovell. As a young man, Lord Lovell had been a professional soldier and had fought across Europe and Ireland. When Richard became king, John Lovell's connection to the de Holland family propelled him into royal service. First becoming Master of the King's Hounds in 1377, and then the Knight of the King's House the following year, and eventually becoming established in the inner circle of King Richard's advisors and courtiers. The king soon appointed Lord Lovell as the governor of the royal castle in Devizes and granted him with land in Wiltshire, effectively making Lovell the king's representative in the southwest. In 1393, the king granted Lovell a licence to crenellate, that meaning that Lord Lovell could now build Wardour Castle. The building of a castle was the ultimate display of recognition and status, and Wardour Castle was to be the last word in grandeur, luxury and originality. With its striking hexagonal plan, traceried windows, delicately adorned vaulting, and chambers with individual fireplaces and latrines. Everything about the castle showed how close Lovell's contacts were with the sophisticated and cosmopolitan court of the king. When King Richard's downfall came in the year 1399, it was fortunate for Lord Lovell that he was not as closely identified with the king as the de Holland family. When King Richard fell, so did the de Hollands, yet Lord Lovell was able to quietly desert the king and defect to the new king, Henry IV. Lord John Lovell died in 1408, survived by his wife Maud and their adult children. Their eldest son, also called John, inherited the family lands, but unfortunately he died 6 years after his father in 1414. The Lovells' estates then passed to Lord Lovell's grandson, William, the 7th Lord Lovell. William's interests lay outside of Wardour, and he concentrated his efforts on rebuilding the family manor at Minster. And although Minster Lovell Hall, as it became known, did not reflect the castle imagery of Wardour, its rooms and facilities were nevertheless luxuriant and modern. The Lovell family then entered into the oscillations of the War of the Roses, and their possessions were successively lost and recovered, as the successors of two of King Edward III's younger sons, the Duke of York and the Duke of Lancaster, struggled for supremacy and the crown. William Lovell's son, John, supported the Lancastrian king Henry VI. However, when King Henry was deposed by Edward IV in 1461, the Lovells' estates were confiscated. John Lovell did manage to make his peace with King Edward and succeeded in reacquiring his lands, all that is but for the exception of Wardour Castle. When John Lovell died, his son Francis was only 8 years old, and with no one suitable to take care of him, Francis Lovell was placed under the guardianship of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Francis was joined by King Edward's younger brother Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, who would later become King Richard III. Francis Lovell remained close to Richard for the rest of their lives, and King Richard elevated Francis to the rank of Viscount and loaded him with grants and honours. Along with William Catesby, Richard Ratcliffe, the King and Lovell were mocked by supporters of the King's rival Henry Tudor. The cat, the rat, and love-a-lad dog ruleth all England under a hog. However, all the titles and favours given to Lovell evaporated in 1485 when King Richard III lost his crown and his life to King Henry VII at the Battle of Bosworth Field, although Francis fought on for a further 2 years against the new king, eventually disappearing following the Yorkists' final defeat at the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487. Since Wardour Castle had become possession of the crown in 1461, it went through a confusing chain of changing owners before finally being sold in 1547 to the ancestor of the current owners, Sir Thomas Arundell. The Arundells were an old and well-established family of Cornish gentry, who by the 16th century had split into numerous branches, the chief of which were the Arundells of Trerris and the Arundells of Lanherne. Thomas Arundell was the younger son of Sir John Arundel of Lanherne, with his own way to make in the world. Thomas started his career in the service of King Henry VIII's chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey. Thomas then went on to become a successful government official, a privy councillor, and eventually honoured with a knighthood. In the year 1530, 17 years before buying Wardour Castle, Sir Thomas Arundell married Margaret Howard, the niece of the Duke of Norfolk. Margaret's youngest sister, Catherine, became King Henry VIII's fifth wife in 1541. But fortunately for Sir Arundel, he was not implicated in the circumstances that led to Catherine's fall and execution in 1542. Sir Thomas did though become connected with the Duke of Somerset, who ruled England as protector during the minority of King Edward VI. However, this association proved fatal for Sir Arundel when the Duke of Somerset was deposed by the Duke of Northumberland in 1551, the outcome of which was that Somerset and Arundel were then executed and their properties confiscated. Sir Thomas Arundel's son, Matthew Arundell, enjoyed better luck than his father. Matthew had the gift of keeping in with the right people in power. He was a Catholic under Queen Mary and then a Protestant under Queen Elizabeth I, remaining in favour during both reigns. Of the forfeited possessions of his father, some had been returned to his mother on the condition that they reverted back to the crown on her death. However, in 1554, Queen Mary granted that the properties should revert to Matthew Arundell on the death of his mother and not the crown, although this did not include Wardour Castle. Matthew Arundell was then in Queen Elizabeth's service for 26 years and married one of her ladies-in-waiting, Margaret Willoughby. In later life, Arundell would write of his time with the Queen, Her Majesty, I think, was scarce at any time offended with me, who was as acceptable a man as any of my place or capacity. With royal favour and his family's property secured, Matthew Arundell bought back Wardour Castle in 1570. Upon receiving a knighthood in 1574 and given the profitable post of Collector of Customs at Poole and Sheriff and Deputy Lieutenant of Dorset, Wardour became one of many purchases in Wiltshire, Dorset, Somerset and Devon, which led to Sir Arundel being listed in 1588 as one of the 12 knights of great possessions worthy of being given a peerage. Arundel's purchase of Wardour Castle can be seen then as an act of filial piety and of restitution of his father's honour. Despite Sir Matthew outwardly conforming to the Protestant faith, his contemporaries suspected him of being a Catholic at heart. Indeed, William's brother Charles and his own son and heir Thomas were both openly Catholic and often in trouble as a result. 3 years before William's death, in 1595, Thomas left England to fight in Hungary against the Ottoman Turks. Thomas Arundell had Queen Elizabeth's encouragement, since the aggressive and expanding Ottoman Empire was seen as a great threat to Christian Europe. Thomas fought with such outstanding bravery that he was rewarded by Emperor Rudolph II of Austria with the title of Count of the Holy Roman Empire. On hearing this news, Queen Elizabeth was furious, not so much because it was a Catholic honour given by a Catholic monarch, but because it impugned her own authority. The Queen was said to say, "I would not have my sheep branded with another man's mark." Thomas Arundell was then in trouble and out of favour for the rest of the Queen's reign. Thomas did, however, get on better under the new king, James I, finally achieving an English peerage for his family by being created Baron Arundel of Wardour. Despite his recent elevation, Thomas continued to take risks. He disobeyed royal orders when newly appointed as an army colonel, was suspected of involvement in the gunpowder plot, and became caught up in an argument with the Bishop of Durham, all before attempting to sell Wardour Castle back to the crown. Baron Arundell died in 1639, passing his lands and title to his son, Thomas, the second Baron of Arundel and Wardour. With Thomas Arundell, Wardour Castle became a peaceful place. However, this peace was shattered with the outbreak of civil war in 1642. The Civil War was the culmination of a long struggle between King Charles I and Parliament, as Parliament tried to increase its power at the expense of the king's. In the spring of 1643, Sir Thomas Arundell travelled to Oxford to join the king's cause, leaving behind his 60-year-old wife Blanche. The Parliamentarians may have seen Wardour Castle as a potential threat if properly garrisoned, and certainly believed it contained great wealth with which they could commandeer for their cause. And so, on the 2nd of May 1643, Sir Edward Hungerford, the local parliamentarian commander, arrived to occupy the castle. Sir Hungerford may have expected little resistance, but in fact, Blanche Arundel refused him entry. There are two accounts of the siege that followed, one by the royalist clergyman Bruno Reeves, and one from the memoirs of parliamentarian Edmund Ludlow, who arrived at Wardour with a supporting group of cavalry in the last days of the siege. Unsurprisingly, the royalist account from Bruno Reeves stresses the heroism of the castle's tiny garrison, blazing away at the enemy while the maidservants help them load and reload their muskets. Parliamentarian Edmund Ludlow's account, however, is more restrained. The 25 men in the castle, armed with muskets, were faced by a force of 1,300, but the besiegers only had 2 small cannons to fire against the castle. These had little effect on the castle walls, apart from one ball bursting through a window and damaging a chimney piece. Having got nowhere with their cannon, the besiegers tried letting off barrels of gunpowder, first in a tunnel leading to the castle, and then in one of the 2 main drains. The first explosion had no effect, and the second shook the castle but did little damage. The parliamentarians then inserted further barrels of gunpowder into the drains and set an hourglass in motion, threatening another larger explosion if the castle did not surrender. The defenders soon agreed and surrendered on the 8th of May. The siege had lasted 7 days. After being taken prisoner to Shaftesbury, Blanche Arundel was allowed to take refuge in Salisbury, where she would soon learn that her husband, Thomas Arundel, had died of wounds received at the Battle of Stratton near Oxford on the 19th of May. With the castle now in the hands of Parliament, Edmund Ludlow moved in with his troop of cavalry and a company of infantry as a garrison. Ludlow remained there until December, when Thomas and Blanche Arundel's son, Henry, now the third Lord Arundel, came with a large force to retake the castle. Henry Arundel had brought with him larger cannons than what the Parliamentarian force had used against the castle, but even so the castle withstood the fire. The only answer to retake the castle was with, as before, an explosion. An engineer was sent for, and together with miners from the Mendip Hills, a shaft was dug under the castle walls and a gunpowder mine laid ready for firing. It can be assumed that Henry Arundel was not overjoyed at blowing up his own castle and perhaps thought that Ludlow would surrender. The mine, however, seems to have been triggered by accident and made a significant hole in the castle wall. However, after 3 days of trying to storm the breach, the Royalist forces failed to gain access. Another tunnel was then dug and another mine laid, and surrender was demanded. This time though, the Parliamentarians accepted surrender, ending the second siege of Wardour Castle. Having blown up his castle in order to recover it, Henry Arundel was not allowed to keep it for very long. As a result of the final victory of Parliament in 1648, followed the execution of King Charles I in 1649. Wardour Castle was surrendered and the estates of the Arundel family were confiscated. Henry Arundel would later recover the bulk of his estates when the monarchy was restored and Charles II became king in 1660. Yet despite the restitution of Wardour, Arundel made no attempt to restore or repair the castle, choosing instead to move to Hampshire, enter into politics and keep a pack of hunting dogs.